just trying to do something nice for my daughter. Emma had just started high school, and with the endless assignments piling up, I figured she needed a proper study space, a desk, a chair, something to help her stay organized. Between juggling work and raising her alone, I didn't have a lot of extra cash to spend on furniture. So I turned to Facebook Marketplace. I'd bought and sold things on there before: kids' clothes, an old coffee table, a couple of used textbooks. It was always fine, but you hear the stories. The ones that start with, "It seemed like a good deal," and end with a missing person report. I never thought I'd end up in one of those stories myself. It was a Wednesday night when I found the listing. A beautiful vintage oak desk, solid wood, deep brown finish. The kind of thing you'd see in an old professor's office, polished from years of careful use. And the price? $70. Too good to be true. I clicked on the seller's profile. His name was Greg Larson. His page looked normal enough. Some photos of him fishing, a dog in the background of one. Nothing screamed psycho. I messaged him. "Is this still available?" Within minutes he responded, "Yep, still have it. You interested?" We went back and forth a little. I asked about scratches, drawer space, weight. He was polite, quick to reply. Said he was downsizing, moving into a smaller apartment, and couldn't take it with him. Then he hit me with something that made me pause. "The desk is in a storage unit just outside Phoenix. I can meet you there tomorrow morning." A storage unit? I hesitated. Meeting strangers was one thing, but inside an enclosed space? Every true crime podcast I'd ever listened to whispered a warning in my ear, but I wanted that desk. I rationalized it. He was downsizing. That made sense. Plus, his listing had real pictures. His profile had real photos. It wasn't like he was some faceless creep lurking in the depths of the internet. So, against my better judgment, I said yes. The next morning, I pulled up to the storage facility. It was one of those self-possessing places on the outskirts of town, just off the highway. The kind with long, endless rows of identical metal doors, stretching like a maze into the distance. The air was still, the morning sun casting sharp shadows against the pavement. A single security camera blinked above the entrance. Other than that, the lot was empty, except for a maintenance worker in the distance, pushing a cart of supplies. Then, I saw Greg. He arrived a few minutes later in an old blue pickup truck. Stepping out, he looked exactly like his profile picture. Baseball cap, flannel shirt, jeans. But something about him made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was the way he barely made eye contact. Maybe it was how he didn't smile, just nodded in my direction like this was a business transaction he'd rather not be a part of. "Don't overthink it," I told myself. "The desk's in here," he said, jerking his thumb toward one of the units. He walked ahead, pulling a key from his pocket. I followed, my steps hesitant. The unit was about halfway down the row. He unlocked the padlock, gripped the metal door, and slid it up with a heavy clang. Inside, the space was dimly lit, crammed with furniture, boxes, and random tools. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old wood. "There," Greg said, stepping aside. The desk was in the back. It looked just as perfect as the photos. Polished wood, deep oak color, smooth edges. For a moment, my excitement pushed away my unease. "Looks great," I said, stepping inside. "Mind if I check the drawers?" "Of course," he said. "Come on in." I hesitated at the threshold. Something about stepping into that dark, cramped space made my skin crawl. But Greg was standing there, holding the door open for me. What was I supposed to do, turn and run like some paranoid freak? I stepped inside. The second my foot crossed the line, the door slammed shut behind me. The sound echoed off the metal walls. The light from outside cut off in an instant. My whole body locked up. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. Greg was standing by the door, padlock in hand. Click. He snapped it shut. "It's just so no one disturbs us," he said, smiling. His grin sent ice through my veins. Every hair on my body stood on end. I forced a weak laugh, taking a step back. "You know, I should check if this will fit in my car. My brother's waiting outside. He's better at judging these things." Greg's smile faltered, just for a second. Then it came back. "Oh? I didn't see anyone with you when you pulled up." The blood drained from my face. He'd been watching me. I swallowed hard. Yeah. He's just walking around. He hates waiting in the car. Greg's eyes narrowed slightly. His fingers drummed against the padlock. I forced myself to stay calm, act normal. Let's go outside, I said. I'll check the measurements. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he shrugged and pulled the key from his pocket. Sure, he said. With agonizing slowness, he unlocked the padlock. The second the metal door rolled up, I bolted. I didn't care how it looked. I ran for my car, heart slamming against my ribs. Behind me, Greg called my name, his voice demanding, but I didn't stop. I jumped in, slammed the doors shut, and locked them. Greg stood by his truck, watching me, his face unreadable. Then, as calmly as if nothing had happened, he climbed into his pickup and drove off. I called the police. By the time officers arrived, Greg was long gone. They took my statement, checked the storage unit, but there wasn't much they could do. He didn't technically commit a crime, one officer said, scratching his head. But yeah, that's unsettling. I sat in my car, shaking. Later, I found out Greg had multiple complaints against him. Women who'd gone to meet him for furniture sales, only for things to take a dark turn. I never used Facebook Marketplace again, because no matter how harmless someone seems, you can never be too careful, especially when you're alone. They say your instincts are usually right, that when the hair on the back of your neck stands up, or your stomach twists into knots, you should listen. After what happened with Greg, I wish I'd trusted mine sooner. But here's the thing, I'm not the only one who ignored the warning signs. Daniel Wright did too. He's a retired firefighter from Omaha, a tough guy who's seen more than his fair share of danger, the kind of person you'd expect to spot a bad situation a mile away. But even Daniel, with all his experience, almost didn't make it out of his Facebook Marketplace nightmare alive. I heard Daniel's story through a mutual friend after my encounter with Greg. It shook me to my core, not just because of what happened to him, but because of how easily it could happen to any of us. Daniel had always been a hands-on guy. Even after retiring, he loved tinkering in his garage. Over the years, he'd accumulated more tools than he needed. Power drills, saws, and even an old lathe that sat collecting dust in the corner. So one afternoon, he decided to list a few of his extras on Facebook Marketplace, hoping to free up some space. That's when he got the message. The buyer's name was Mike Russo. His profile picture showed a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, standing next to a shiny green lawnmower. His profile wasn't brand new. There were a handful of photos dating back a couple of years. Pictures of fishing trips, backyard barbecues, even a dog. "Hey, is the power saw still available?" Mike wrote. Daniel responded quickly. They chatted back and forth, and it turned out Mike was willing to trade a nearly new lawnmower for the saw, something Daniel actually needed since his old mower had sputtered out weeks earlier. A Honda HRX, barely used, Mike claimed. Just don't need it anymore. Downsized to a townhouse with no yard. It seemed like a good deal, maybe a little too good, but Daniel figured he could tell if something was off when he saw the mower in person. "Great," Daniel replied. "Where do you want to meet?" Mike suggested his house. Said the mower was too heavy to transport and that he could show Daniel how it worked on the spot. He gave an address in a residential neighborhood on the outskirts of Omaha. Daniel hesitated. Meeting at someone's house wasn't his usual practice, but the area wasn't sketchy, and he figured the guy's profile seemed legit. Besides, he was a 6'2", 220-pound firefighter. He could handle himself, right? That Saturday, Daniel loaded the saw into his truck and drove across town. The neighborhood was older but quiet. Modest ranch-style homes with trimmed lawns, kids riding bikes, and retirees gardening. It felt safe, until he pulled up to the address Mike had given him. The house stood out. While the neighboring yards were neat, this one was overgrown with weeds and dotted with rusted tools. A faded blue sedan sat crookedly in the driveway. The blinds were drawn tight over every window. Daniel parked on the street, not wanting to get boxed in. His gut told him something was off, but his practical side whispered, maybe the guy's just messy. He grabbed the saw and stepped out. Before he reached the porch, the front door opened. "Hey, you must be Daniel," Mike called out. He looked like his picture, just a little too wide. His smile stretched a little too wide. He wore a sweat-stained baseball cap and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes. Yeah, Daniel replied, shifting the saw under his arm. The mower's out back? Yep, right this way. Mike led him around the side of the house to the backyard. Daniel noticed the man didn't turn his back on him. He kept glancing over his shoulder. The backyard was worse than the front. A sagging shed sat in one corner, and the lawn was more dirt than grass. The mower was positioned in the middle of it, pristine and gleaming in the sunlight. Daniel whistled. Wow, this looks brand new. Told ya, Mike said. Go ahead, check it out. Daniel knelt to examine the mower. The blades were sharp, the wheels clean. He yanked the pull cord. It started immediately, the engine humming smoothly. He was starting to feel relieved. Maybe this was just a good deal after all. Until he heard the crunch of gravel behind him. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch movement from the corner of his eye. Another man was walking into the yard from the alley. Stocky, broad-chested, with a shaved head and a thick beard. He didn't say a word, just crossed his arms and stood there. Mike gave a nervous chuckle. That's just my buddy Steve. Came to help with the mower. Daniel stood up, his pulse quickening. He glanced toward the house. The side gate, his only easy exit, was now behind Steve. Well, Daniel said, forcing a smile. Looks good. Let's finish the trade. Mike's smile didn't reach his eyes. Yeah, about that. Steve and I were talking, and we figure the saw's nice and all, but the mower's worth more. How about you throw in $200 cash? Daniel's stomach dropped. His mind raced. He shook his head. We agreed on a straight trade. Yeah, Steve said, stepping closer. His voice was gravelly. But plans change. Daniel's gaze flicked to the shed behind him. The door was slightly ajar, and something glinted in the shadows. A metal crowbar, propped against the wall. He smiled again, pretending to be oblivious. Sure. Let me grab my wallet from my truck. Mike and Steve exchanged a look. Okay, Mike said, gesturing toward the side gate. Steve shifted to let him pass, though not by much. Daniel walked slowly toward the gate, every nerve screaming at him to stay calm. He reached the path, stepped past Steve, and then he ran. The moment his foot hit the driveway, he heard footsteps pounding after him. His truck was parked across the street. He sprinted full tilt, barely hearing Steve's curses behind him. Get him, Mike yelled. Daniel hit the street, skidded across gravel, and yanked his door open. He slammed it shut just as Steve reached for the handle. He locked the doors, jammed the keys into the ignition, and floored it. Steve punched the window as the truck lurched forward, his face twisted with rage. Daniel swerved around the sedan, tires screeching, and didn't stop until he reached a nearby gas station. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely call 911. The police arrived within minutes. Daniel gave them the address, the names, and descriptions of the men. Officers went to the house, but by the time they got there, Mike and Steve were gone. The mower was still sitting in the yard, untouched, but the shed was empty. The crowbar was gone. Later, the detective called Daniel. The house had been rented with a fake name. The car in the driveway was stolen, and Mike Russo, the Facebook profile, vanished the moment Daniel drove away. They never found them. Daniel doesn't use Facebook Marketplace anymore, and when he told me his story, I realized something terrifying. Predators don't just lurk in dark alleys or empty parking garages. Sometimes, they're smiling behind a screen, offering a deal too good to resist, and they're counting on you to ignore the voice in your head that says, "This doesn't feel right." After hearing Daniel's story, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The setup, the isolation, the moment when instincts screamed to run. It mirrored what happened to me at the storage unit, and yet, we both brushed aside those gut feelings until it was almost too late. It turns out, ignoring those instincts is more common than you'd think. Take Sarah Mitchell, for example. She's a kindergarten teacher from Asheville, North Carolina, a small-town woman with a big heart and an innocent outlook on life. Or at least, she used to have one, until she sold a bookshelf on Facebook Marketplace. Sarah told me her story after she saw a post I made in a local online safety group. My experience with Greg had turned me into a bit of a cautionary tale, and when Sarah read it, she reached out with her own nightmare. It started so normal, she said. Just a simple bookshelf. She'd had the bookshelf for years, a sturdy oak piece she'd picked up secondhand when she first moved into her apartment. But recently, she'd been redecorating, trying to give her place a cleaner, more minimalist look. The bookshelf, though solid, was scratched and bulky, so one rainy afternoon, she listed it on Facebook Marketplace. She priced it low, just $40, hoping for a quick sale. Within an hour, she got a message. The buyer's name was Jack Porter. His profile showed a smiling, middle-aged man standing beside a Labrador retriever. No red flags. His messages were friendly and straightforward. Jack: "Hey, is the bookshelf still available?" Sarah: "Yep, still here." Jack: "Awesome. I've been looking for something like that for my study. Can I pick it up tonight?" Sarah hesitated. Evening pickups weren't her usual practice, but she figured she wouldn't even need to let him inside. The bookshelf was already in the garage, just a few steps from the driveway. "Sure. 6:30 okay?" "Perfect. See you then." 6:30 came, and right on time, Jack pulled into the driveway in a dark red pickup. Sarah opened the garage and stepped out. Jack climbed from the truck with an easy smile. He was taller than she expected, well over 6 feet, and wiry. He wore jeans, a black hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low enough to cast a shadow over his eyes. "Hey there," he said, flashing that toothy grin. "Hi." "Here it is," Sarah said, gesturing to the bookshelf. Jack ran his fingers along the wood. "Looks even better in person. My books are gonna love this." He chuckled softly, almost to himself. Sarah forced a polite laugh. Something about the way he touched the bookshelf made her uncomfortable, as if he were more interested in the transaction itself than the item. They settled on cash. Jack handed her 2 20s and helped hoist the bookshelf into the bed of his truck. "Thanks again," he said, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm sure I'll be back for more." "You've got great taste." Sarah smiled awkwardly. "Well, this was pretty much it." Jack's smile widened. "Oh, I bet there's more." Sarah didn't know what to say. She waved as he backed out of the driveway, his headlights vanishing into the rain. She thought that was the end of it. 2 days later, she saw his truck again. It was parked across the street when she left for work. The rain-splattered windshield made it hard to tell if someone was inside, but she recognized the dented front fender immediately. She told herself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. But that evening, she saw it again. Different spot, same street, engine idling for a few minutes before driving off. Her stomach twisted. She locked her doors, closed her blinds, and tried to sleep. But the next morning, when she opened her front door, she found something wedged in the crack. A crumpled piece of paper with 5 words scrawled in shaky, uneven handwriting. "You've got more inside, Sarah." Sarah called the police immediately. The responding officer, a weary-looking man named Deputy Harris, took her statement. He looked at the note, sighed, and shook his head. "Unfortunately, it's not enough to press charges," he said. "Could be a prank. You know anyone who might do that?" Sarah shook her head, her fingers trembling. "The guy who bought my bookshelf. Jack Porter. He kept watching my house." The officer wrote down the name. "We'll check it out. Meanwhile, make sure your locks are secure. And maybe avoid Facebook Marketplace for a while." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She kept the lights on and jumped at every noise. The next day, she left work early to buy a security camera. By the time she got home, she found her front door slightly ajar. The lock was splintered, the door frame cracked. Inside, nothing was missing. Her TV, laptop, and jewelry were untouched, but every cabinet door was wide open. Her bedroom dresser drawers were pulled out, their contents dumped onto the floor. The only thing missing was a framed photo from her nightstand, a picture of Sarah smiling with her younger sister at a beach trip last summer. The police came again, this time taking the break-in more seriously. They reviewed her new security camera footage. The system had been set up by the delivery company that morning, but it hadn't recorded much yet, except one clip. At 2:37 p.m., a man approached the house. His hood was pulled low, his face turned from the camera, but when he stepped onto the porch, he turned toward the lens, just for a second. It was Jack. The police put out a bulletin and promised to patrol the area. That night, Sarah stayed with her sister. Around 3 a.m., her sister shook her awake. "Sarah, your phone," she whispered. "It's ringing." Sarah sat up, disoriented, and grabbed her phone. The screen showed an unknown number. She answered hesitantly. At first, there was only breathing. Then, "Told you, you've got more inside." She dropped the phone. The police traced the call, but it was from a disposable burner phone. They advised Sarah to stay somewhere else for a few nights. She did, but on the third night, her sister woke her again. "He's outside." Sarah ran to the window. The red truck was parked across the street, headlights off. A shadowed figure sat in the driver's seat. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, the truck was gone. Weeks passed with no sign of Jack. Sarah moved to a new apartment across town, changed her phone number, and deleted her Facebook account. But sometimes, even now, she swears she sees that truck in her rearview mirror, and every so often she finds notes taped to her mailbox with the same message: "You've got more inside." When Sarah finished telling me her story, she took a deep breath and said, "I never realized how much someone could learn from a single online sale. I didn't know what to say." Because she's right. When you let a stranger into your world, whether through a sale, a trade, or a simple interaction, you're opening a door. And some people don't just walk through it, they make themselves at home. After hearing Sarah's story, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd all made the same mistake. We trusted the illusion of safety online, a smiling profile picture, a friendly message, a good deal, but behind every screen is a stranger. And some strangers aren't just trying to sell you a piece of furniture, they're trying to lure you into a trap. Sarah's bookshelf stalker had crossed a line, watching her for weeks, leaving notes that made her skin crawl. The thought of him rifling through her drawers, taking that photo, still makes me shudder. And then I heard about Ethan Blake. His story made me delete every marketplace app on my phone for good. Ethan was a computer technician in Detroit, a tech guy, smart and cautious. He'd heard the horror stories like mine and Sarah's, so he had rules. Never share his home address, always meet in public places, and never go alone. But rules mean nothing when the other side has a plan. Ethan's flat-screen TV died right before the Super Bowl. It didn't just stop working, it let out a loud crack, sparked, and went dark mid-session. He unplugged it, gave it a few troubleshooting tries, but the thing was toast. He wasn't about to shell out $1,000 for a new one, so that night he opened Facebook Marketplace and typed 60-inch TV. It took about 5 minutes to find what looked like the deal of the century. A Samsung 65-inch smart TV, just a year old, $250. The pictures showed it mounted on a wall, screen bright and crisp, no cracks or damage. The seller's name was Tom Mitchell. The profile had a couple of family photos, a middle-aged guy with short hair posing with a German Shepherd. Normal stuff. Ethan messaged him. "Hey, is the TV still available?" Tom replied almost instantly, "Yeah, selling it 'cause we're upgrading to a bigger one." The messages flowed naturally. Tom told him the TV worked perfectly and came with the remote. Ethan asked if he could meet the next day in a public parking lot. Maybe a Target or a gas station. "Actually, it's already packed up at my old rental property," Tom explained. "The new owners want it gone by tomorrow." "Can you meet me there?" Ethan hesitated. The address Tom provided was in an older part of town, somewhere Ethan didn't recognize. But he wanted that TV, and besides, he figured, he'd just stay alert, park in front of the house, and keep the deal quick. The next afternoon, Ethan followed his GPS through Detroit's outer neighborhoods. The homes became older, more run down, peeling paint, cracked sidewalks, boarded up windows. The street Tom had given him was the worst yet. Rows of abandoned houses, overgrown yards. The kind of street that looked like a crime scene waiting to happen. He slowed down and double-checked the address. The house was on the right, number 1734. The place looked condemned. Plywood covered the windows. The grass had grown into knee-high weeds. Trash and broken bricks littered the front yard. There was no car in the driveway. Ethan shifted in his seat, his pulse quickening. He typed a quick message to Tom. Hey, I'm here. House looks empty. You close by? A few minutes passed. Nothing. Ethan was about to pull away when his phone dinged. Yeah, I'm inside. Come around back. Side gate's open. Ethan gripped the steering wheel. Every instinct told him to leave, but he told himself Tom was probably just finishing up work inside. Maybe he was patching drywall or cleaning out old junk. Still, Ethan wasn't stupid. He grabbed the small folding knife from his glove box and slid it into his jacket pocket. Then he stepped out. The sidewalk crunched under his shoes as he approached the side gate. The wood slats were weathered and splintered, and it was, as promised, a pager. He pushed it open. The backyard was empty except for a rusted barbecue grill and a sagging lawn chair. A basement door stood open, leading into darkness. "Tom?" Ethan called. A voice drifted up from below, low, muffled. "Yeah, down here. TV's in the basement. Had to move it out of the living room." Ethan squinted. The stairwell leading down was narrow, unlit except for a faint glow near the bottom. His gut twisted. Why would the TV be in the basement? He stood there, 1 foot on the first concrete step. His eyes adjusted to the dim light. He noticed something just inside the basement door. Scuff marks on the wall, dark smudges near the handrail. Then something else caught his attention, a faint shadow. Halfway down the stairs, pressed against the wall like someone was trying to stay hidden. His heart slammed against his ribs. He took a slow step back, forcing his voice to sound calm. You know what? I forgot to measure my entertainment center. I'll text you later." Silence. Then, "Come on, man, it's right here." The voice sounded sharper now, edgy. Ethan turned, his muscles tensed as he moved toward the gate. That's when he heard it. Footsteps. Fast footsteps pounding up the basement stairs. He sprinted. He reached the gate and yanked it open just as a figure lunged from the shadows. The man was taller than Ethan, wiry, with a ski mask pulled down over his face. He swung a crowbar at Ethan's legs. Ethan dodged, tripping over the broken pavement. The man swung again. The metal scraped his jacket as Ethan scrambled backward. He bolted toward his car. Behind him, he heard more footsteps. 2 sets now. Another figure appeared from the side of the house, shorter, bulkier, gripping what looked like a length of pipe. Ethan hit the pavement at full speed, sprinting toward his car. The taller man was right behind him. He could hear the man's breathing, ragged and close. His car key was already in his hand. He slammed into the driver's side door, jammed the key into the lock, and yanked it open. The taller man lunged for the door handle. Ethan shoved the door into him and threw himself inside. The man grabbed the door frame and tried to pry it open. Ethan shifted into drive and floored it. The tires screeched. The taller man lost his grip and tumbled backward onto the pavement. Ethan didn't stop until he reached a gas station 3 miles away. His hands trembled as he called the police. The cops arrived within minutes. Ethan gave them the address, his story spilling out between shaky breaths. They sent 2 patrol cars to the house, but when they got there, the basement door was closed. The scuff marks were gone. The house was abandoned. The men had vanished. The only evidence left behind was a length of rope on the basement stairs and 2 sets of muddy boot prints. The police told Ethan later that similar incidents had been reported recently. Fake listings, isolated houses, lured victims. "Looks like you were their next target," the officer said. Ethan stopped looking for deals online after that. When he told me his story, I asked him what scared him the most. "It wasn't seeing that shadow in the stairwell," he said. "It was the moment I realized they knew I was coming. They'd been waiting." Facebook Marketplace is supposed to connect people, but sometimes it connects you with someone who's been watching, planning, and waiting for you to show up. And when you step into their trap, they don't see a customer, they see prey. When Ethan told me about the shadow in the basement and the men waiting in silence, I thought that was as bad as it could get. But I was wrong, because sometimes the danger doesn't wait in a dark basement or an empty lot. Sometimes it's right there with you, watching, listening, and you don't even know it. Jessica Thompson learned that the hard way. Jessica is a 42-year-old office manager from Denver, Colorado. A practical woman, sharp and organized. She's the kind of person who triple checks the locks before bed and always looks over her shoulder in parking garages. Not paranoid, just cautious. But even the cautious ones can get caught off guard when danger looks like a good deal. Jessica had been working from home for almost a year when she decided her office needed a refresh. Her old recliner, the one she'd used for late-night paperwork and virtual meetings, had finally given out. Her late Sinclair microphone. Her flirty buyer used to sell her Sinclair videos, and when somebody wanted a late-night paperwork and virtual meetings, had finally given out. The cushioning sagged, the armrests creaked, and sitting in it gave her lower back spasms. So one Friday night, after pouring herself a glass of wine and settling onto the couch, she opened Facebook Marketplace. The listings were all the same: overpriced leather chairs, worn-out fabric recliners with stains you didn't want to identify. But then she found it, a brown leather recliner, slightly worn but still elegant, the kind of chair that made you picture sitting by a fireplace with a book and a glass of bourbon. The price? $100, too good to pass up. The seller's name was Paul Harris. His profile picture showed a smiling man with graying hair holding a puppy. He had a few public photos, fishing trips, a backyard barbecue, a kid's birthday party. It all looked perfectly normal. Jessica messaged him. "Is the chair still available?" "Yes, still available. I can even deliver it if you're nearby." That should have been her first red flag. Most sellers didn't offer delivery, but Jessica thought maybe he's just being helpful. They arranged for delivery the next morning. Paul was even polite enough to text her when he was on his way. The next day, at exactly 10 a.m., a beat-up white van pulled into Jessica's driveway. Paul stepped out, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and a wide, friendly smile. He wore a Denver Broncos cap and jeans that looked like they'd seen 1,000-yard work Saturdays. "Morning, Jessica," he called cheerfully. "Hope I'm not too early." "Nope, right on time," she replied. He opened the van's side door and pulled out the recliner. It looked even better than the photos. Jessica helped guide it through the doorway and into her home office. "You sure this is only $100? She asked, half joking. "It looks brand new," Paul chuckled. "Yep, just didn't fit our new living room setup." She paid him in cash. He tipped his cap and left without incident. That first night, Jessica sat in the chair with a book and a cup of tea. The leather was smooth and cool beneath her hands. It reclined perfectly, the footrest gliding up without a sound. Comfortable, sturdy, a great deal. But when she leaned her head back, she heard something faint. Click, click, click. She sat up. The sound stopped. She checked the chair, running her fingers along the seams. Nothing felt unusual. She leaned back again. Click, click, click. Jessica frowned. It wasn't loud, more like the ticking of a distant clock. She figured it was the internal mechanism, and made a mental note to oil it later. The next night, during a Zoom meeting, she heard it again. She was mid-sentence when the faint click, click, click started. The sound seemed to come from somewhere beneath her head. She muted her mic and adjusted her position. The clicking stopped. After the meeting, curiosity got the better of her. She flipped the chair onto its side, unzipped the fabric lining underneath, and shone a flashlight inside. Wires. Thin, black wires running along the frame. Far more than what a recliner's motor would need. Her pulse quickened. She followed the wires to a small, square object nestled into the fabric. A camera lens stared back at her. Jessica's stomach dropped. She scrambled to disconnect the camera, yanking the wires free. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she turned the tiny device over in her hands. No brand, no markings, just a small pinhole lens. She placed it on the desk, then sat in the chair again, testing angles. The camera had a perfect view of her desk and computer screen. The realization hit her like ice water. Someone had been watching her work, watching her meetings, watching God knows what else. She stood and closed the blinds. Jessica called the police. An officer arrived within the hour. He examined the chair and the hidden camera, nodding grimly. "We've seen these before," he said. "Usually in hotels or Airbnbs, but furniture sales are a new twist." "Can you trace it?" she asked. "We'll try. The next few days were hell. Jessica moved her desk into the living room and draped a blanket over the recliner. She felt exposed, like the walls of her home had turned into one-way mirrors. Then the police called back. The camera had a wireless transmitter. Whoever set it up had likely been watching live footage. The signal led to an IP address registered to a prepaid mobile hotspot. Untraceable, but here's the thing, the officer said. The hotspot pinged from close by. Within half a mile of your address. Jessica's vision blurred. So? He's been nearby? Possibly watching from a parked car, the officer said. Do you remember what Paul Harris looked like? She described him. The officer paused. That doesn't match the real Paul Harris. We contacted the person whose identity was used for the account. He's a retired school principal, never sold a chair in his life. That night, Jessica barely slept. Every time headlights passed her window, her chest tightened. At 2:13 a.m., a notification appeared on her phone. Motion detected, office camera. Jessica froze. The camera in her office, the one she'd moved after discovering the hidden device, was still active, linked to her security app. She tapped the notification and opened the live feed. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the desk lamp she'd left on. And standing in the middle of the room was a figure, a man wearing a Denver Broncos cap. He turned toward the camera and smiled. Then he held up something small and shiny, the missing camera from the recliner. Jessica screamed and called 911. The police arrived within minutes, but the man was gone. They found muddy footprints leading from the office to the back door. The lock had been picked, the frame barely scratched. The recliner was gone too. The officers reviewed the footage and took Jessica to a safe location for the night. But before leaving, one officer paused in the office doorway. Ma'am, do you have any kids? Jessica shook her head. But dementia. The officer held up a piece of paper he'd found tucked into the chair's empty frame. It was a printed photo of Jessica sitting at her desk, taken from the hidden camera. Across the bottom, someone had written in black marker, "Smile more. I like when you smile." Jessica moved out of that apartment the next day. The fake profile vanished overnight. The chair was never recovered. And to this day, she can't sit down in a piece of second-hand furniture without wondering who might be watching from the other side. When she finished telling me this story, she said something that sent chills through me. You don't know how vulnerable you are until someone shows you. I never knew my house was just a stage, and I was the star of a show I never agreed to be in. And that's the thing about Facebook Marketplace. You think you're buying an object, but sometimes you're giving away far more than you realize. After Jessica's story, I didn't sleep for days. The idea that someone could sit unseen and watch your most private moments through something as ordinary as a chair, that was terrifying. But it also made me realize something. When you buy something secondhand, you're not just taking home an object. Sometimes you bring home a stranger's obsession. No one knew that better than Ben Walker. Ben's a single dad from Portland, Oregon. He's a laid-back guy who works in accounting, loves hiking, and spends most of his free time with his 9-year-old daughter, Lily. She's his world. A curious, sweet kid with a fascination for old toys, especially dolls. Porcelain ones, to be exact. Ben never understood the appeal. The painted smiles and glassy eyes always gave him the creeps. But Lily adored them, so when she asked for more to add to her collection, he didn't think twice about looking for some online. That's how he found the listing. It was a chilly Saturday morning when Ben opened Facebook Marketplace and typed porcelain dolls. He figured he'd find a few, maybe overpay for one or two. Instead, the perfect listing appeared at the top of the page. Vintage porcelain doll collection, $75. Hand-painted. Unique. Must go ASAP. There was a single picture, 5 dolls sitting on a shelf, their delicate features frozen in eerie, timeless smiles. The seller's name was Margaret Crane. Her profile picture showed an elderly woman sitting in a rocking chair on a porch, knitting a pink scarf. The bio read, "Lover of antiques and handmade treasures." Ben messaged her. "Hi, is the doll collection still available?" The response came almost immediately. "Yes, dear, still available. Would you like to meet today?" They arranged to meet at a flea market on the outskirts of Portland later that afternoon. Margaret said she'd bring the dolls with her. When Ben and Lily arrived at the flea market, it was busier than expected. Rows of booths lined the cracked asphalt lot. selling everything from homemade candles to rusted farm tools. Ben spotted an elderly woman near the back. She was sitting in a folding chair beside a small table, the 5 porcelain dolls arranged neatly in front of her. The dolls were even more striking in person, painted with precise detail, their glass eyes gleaming in the afternoon light. Lily gasped, "They're perfect, Dad!" Ben smiled, though the sight of the dolls unsettled him. Their eyes seemed to follow him. "You're Margaret?" he asked. The woman nodded. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her skin was pale and papery, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "They've been waiting for a new home," Margaret said softly, voice like sandpaper. Ben forced a chuckle. "Well, I think they've found one." He handed her the cash. Margaret counted it meticulously, then pushed the dolls toward Lily. "Take good care of them," she said. "They're very attached." The dolls went straight to Lily's bedroom. She lined them up on a shelf above her bed, giving them names: Rose, Bella, Sophia, Emma, and Margaret. "Like the nice lady who gave them to me," Lily said. Ben didn't correct her. That night, after Lily was asleep, Ben passed by her door and caught a glimpse of the dolls. Their eyes seemed to shimmer in the darkness, reflecting the faint glow of the nightlight. He closed the door and went to bed. The next morning, Lily ran into the kitchen with her hair sticking up in wild tufts. "Dad, you moved the dolls, right?" Ben looked up from his coffee. "What do you mean?" "They were different this morning. Rose was on the floor, and Emma was turned the other way." Ben frowned. "Maybe you bumped the shelf." Lily shook her head. "No, I was asleep." Ben went to her room and checked the shelf. The dolls were sitting there, perfectly still. He adjusted one to show Lily how easily they moved if bumped. See, they probably just shifted. She didn't look convinced. That night, Ben woke up around 2:30 a.m. to a soft thump. He sat up, listening. The sound came from Lily's room. He got up, crept down the hall, and pushed the door open. Lily was asleep, curled under her blankets. One doll lay on the floor, Rose, the one that had moved the night before. Ben sighed and placed Rose back on the shelf. As he turned to leave, he glanced at the dolls. Emma's head was tilted slightly to the side. It hadn't been like that earlier. He stared at the doll for a long time before convincing himself he was imagining things. By the 3rd morning, Lily refused to go into her room. "They don't like me," she whispered. Ben knelt beside her. "They're just dolls, sweetheart." She shook her head violently. "I heard them whispering last night." Ben's skin prickled. What were they whispering? They said, "Why did she leave us?" And then Rose fell again. Ben's stomach turned. He decided to pack the dolls away until Lily calmed down. He grabbed a cardboard box, went to her room, and started lifting them from the shelf. As he placed Rose inside, something caught his eye. The doll's porcelain fingers were smeared with something dark. Dirt? He looked closer. The substance was faintly reddish-brown. His breath caught. He checked the other dolls. All of them had similar smudges on their hands and tiny scuff marks on their porcelain feet, as if they'd been walking through dirt. He put the dolls in the box, sealed it with duct tape, and shoved it into the hall closet. That night, Ben barely slept. Around 3 a.m., he heard creaking footsteps in the hallway. He grabbed a baseball bat and swung open his bedroom door. The hallway was empty. The closet door was ajar. The box lay on the floor, lid peeled back. All 5 dolls were gone. He ran to Lily's room. The dolls were back on the shelf, perfectly arranged. But this time their heads were all turned toward Lily's bed. Ben called the police. The responding officer looked skeptical but agreed to take the dolls in for evidence. A week later, the detective called. "Mr. Walker, we found fingerprints on the dolls," she said. Ben's throat tightened. "Mine and Lily's, right?" "Yes," she said. "But there was another set too. We ran them through the system. They belonged to a woman named Margaret Crane." Ben swallowed hard. "The seller?" The detective hesitated. "That's the thing. Margaret Crane died 5 years ago. She was a doll collector who went missing from a senior care facility. Her body was found months later, buried in the woods behind her home. She'd been dead for weeks, but her fingerprints were found on every doll." Ben hung up and went straight to Lily's room. The shelf was empty. The dolls were gone. The window was open, and in the middle of Lily's bed was a single porcelain hand. After hearing Ben's story, I stopped shopping on Facebook Marketplace entirely. Because sometimes you're not just buying someone's old junk. Sometimes you're opening the door to something that doesn't want to be forgotten. And once it's inside, it might never leave. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for sticking with me through these stories. I know they were unsettling, maybe even terrifying, but that's the point. These aren't just cautionary tales designed to spook you. They're reminders of how quickly a simple online exchange can turn into a dangerous, life-altering experience. I thought what happened to me at that storage unit was an isolated incident, but then I heard Daniel's story about the fake lawnmower trade, Sarah's experience with the stalker who wouldn't let go, Ethan's narrow escape from the abandoned house, Jessica's discovery of the hidden camera, and Ben's haunted encounter with the dolls that didn't want to leave. The pattern became clear. Online marketplaces aren't just virtual garage sales anymore. They're hunting grounds for people with malicious intentions. And what makes it so dangerous is how ordinary it all seems until it's too late. So what can we learn from these stories? First, always trust your instincts. If something feels off, even if you can't explain why, listen to that gut feeling. Melissa ignored hers when she met Greg at the storage unit. Daniel rationalized his discomfort when he saw the messy yard. Jessica brushed aside the odd clicking sound. Every single person had that initial moment of doubt, and every single time it turned out to be justified. Percentant, never meet strangers in isolated locations. Public, well-lit areas with security cameras should be your default for any in-person exchanges. Storage units, side streets, and empty houses are ideal settings for predators. Don't give them the opportunity. Third, protect your privacy. Never give out your home address. If possible, avoid letting strangers know where you live or work. Sarah's stalker exploited that one piece of information and used it to terrorize her for weeks. And Jessica's hidden camera nightmare? It started with a man who knew exactly where she lived and what her daily routine looked like. Lastly, be wary of deals that seem too good to be true. A like-new TV for half the price, a rare antique at a bargain, a perfectly functional chair delivered right to your doorstep. These tactics are designed to bypass your caution and lure you into dangerous situations. The people behind these setups are patient, practiced, and know how to present themselves as harmless. I hope these stories don't just linger in your mind as scary tales, but as reminders to stay vigilant in the digital age. But the world isn't as anonymous as we like to believe. Every message you send, every ad you respond to can open a door into your life. Make sure you're the one deciding which doors to unlock. Thank you again for spending your time with Enigma of the Unknown. If these stories made you think twice before clicking buy now on that too good to be true deal, then I've done my job. Stay safe, stay alert, and remember, some bargains just aren't worth the risk. Until next time, sleep well. If you can.